Hello everyone. Our topic for today is economics, which is the science of effective decision making and its relationship with human flourishing. I want to begin by taking us back 10,000 years, right? So for most of at least the last 10,000 years, quality of life remained largely stagnant for people all around the world, right? On the right, we can see this graph that goes back up to the year 1000, but the same story precedes this graph. So for most of this time, almost everyone is absolutely poor, right? And the life of your parents is the same as the life of your grandparents, and is the same as the life of your great grandparents, and so forth, right? In starting in somewhere in the 1800s, since the Industrial Revolution, um, we start seeing this drastic improvement in the quality of human life. So just to compare some numbers from early in that phase in the 1800s to, let's say, present day, life expectancy on average, and these are numbers for United States, life expectancy went up from around 30 to 75. Child mortality, meaning the chances that a child crosses the age of 5, or there are other measures for the age of 15 and so forth, uh, was super high, from 1 in 4 comes down to 1 in 200. And then because of better food and nutrition, the average height over time increases from around 5'6" to 5'10". And there are also other numbers that I haven't mentioned here. For instance, in the early 1800s, about 80% of the people in the United States were working in agriculture. And today that number is less than 10%. So almost everyone was spending their entire life just producing food, right? Now with all of this increase in wealth, now people are able to do all the other things that our life requires. So here's the big question, right? How did this happen? Is this progress guaranteed to continue, or can it stagnate or reverse? And what role do you, as an average person, play in its fate? Now here's another extremely interesting graph. Now these are prices again from United States, but I believe for most countries in the world you can find some similar data if they publish this data, and the trend is pretty much the same. So you see a whole bunch of things have gotten a lot more expensive since the year 2000. That's important things like healthcare, education, housing, food, and so forth, childcare. And on the other hand, there's also a bunch of things that have become less expensive. They've become cheaper, right? So just cars, clothing, electronics, so on and so forth, right? So clearly, some things are getting worse and other things are getting better. Even though overall things are getting better, this does tell us that we cannot take the progress that we have for granted. There are things that can go wrong, and it is possible for us to prevent that from happening. So that is where economics comes in. Now there's this very interesting quote from Alice in Wonderland. So in this scene, Alice is trying to figure out where to go, and she asks this cat, like, where should I go? And the cat replies, that depends on where you want to end up. And it's the same with economics. So economics can help you achieve your goals based on your chosen standard, based on the direction in which you want to go. But it can't choose that standard for you. So for the purposes of this discussion, we're going to start with this fundamental criteria. You only need economic knowledge if you prefer greater health, happiness, wealth, and wisdom over greater suffering, starvation, sickness, poverty, and folly. In other words, if you prefer human flourishing over human suffering, or you could say human perishing. And so now the question is, how does thinking like an economist help with this, right? So let's take two interesting historical examples and then we'll build from there. So in World War II, there was a situation where a bunch of fighter aircrafts return home from enemy territory. Now the scientists and economists and statisticians, they are given this problem, right? Given this damage report, so the red dots indicate where the aircrafts are hit with the most bullets, right? So given this damage report, where should you add the armor in order to make it more likely that your planes return home safely, in order to minimize the planes that are shot down by the enemy? Now, the simple naive version of this would be to say that, hey, let's just add the armor everywhere, right? But that's not good, because the armor is expensive and it's heavy, so that increases your total cost and it also slows down the plane. So you have to be smarter than that. Now, what you could do is you add the armor only in the places where you see the most damage, right? All the bullet holes in red over there, right? And so let's say that's what an engineer or a scientist would do if they wanted to minimize the cost while still trying to protect the plane. But even that would be exactly wrong. What economists figured out is this. Look, you're only looking at the planes that managed to come back home despite these damages. Meaning, the planes that did not come back home were the ones that were hit in places other than these red spots. So the proper thing to do in order to protect the plane as effectively as possible would be to add the armor in the places where there is no damage reported. And this gives us a very important lesson. Common sense isn't enough in making effective decisions where you need to look at both what is obviously seen and what is missing from the information that is given to you. Let's look at another example to drive this point home further. Well, so this is an extremely interesting quote by an economist, Frederic. The curious task of economics is to demonstrate to men how little they really know about what they imagine they can design. So that's something to keep in mind. Now here's another interesting historical problem. So it is said that during the British Raj in India, there was a problem with an overpopulation of cobras in a certain city. And the aim of the government was to decrease the population of cobras in the city. The way they went about trying to achieve this was by rewarding people for turning in dead cobras. Now, they did not call it the Cobra Reduction Act, that is just a name I've given to it for our discussion. However, the actual effect of this policy was that people started to breed more cobras in order to then turn them in for a reward. By the time the British government realized that this was happening, there was a net increase in the population of cobras, which is the exact opposite of the aim of the program. This brings us to another important lesson. One of the great mistakes is to judge policies and programs by their intentions rather than their results. By the way, this particular problem may not, there is conflicting evidence about whether this is historically true, but similar such examples have happened with rats in France and so forth. Okay, so if someone comes and tells you, hey, do you support a higher minimum wage law? Your answer, regardless, should not be based simply on the name of the policy. Your answer should take into account the actual long-term effects of that policy. And that's what thinking like an economist can teach you to do. All right, so let's take a look at a few definitions, just so that we can effectively navigate the landscape ahead of us. So economics is the study of the effects of actions chosen under scarcity. What is scarcity? So scarcity is the situation where human problems or desires are unlimited, right? But the means or the wealth to fulfill them is limited, right? And it is only because of this fact of scarcity that we need to think about how to effectively make choices in order to do the most we can from our wealth, from our resources, or how to most effectively produce wealth, right? So to be clear, what is wealth? By wealth, I mean the goods, services, and natural resources usable by people to solve their problems and satisfy their desires, right? Now, money in itself is not wealth. It is a medium of exchange to acquire wealth. We'll come to this later in the discussion. Right, so the way I like to think about it is your most fundamental wealth is your life, your time, your energy, and your freedom to use your time and energy in a way most suitable for the problems that you have in life, for the desires that you have in life. Now, observe that any kind of material wealth needs to be created before it can be consumed or distributed. You can't eat food that isn't produced. You can't wear clothes that aren't produced. You can't get healthcare if there is no healthcare available, and so forth. So, wealth must be created intentionally, but it decays automatically. Food expires over time, houses need maintenance, your electronics wears out, your drugs expire over time, and so forth. Right? So, there is this inherent asymmetry in life where doing nothing will not lead you towards a state of prosperity, which is to say, having an abundance of wealth. By simply being in a state of inaction or in a state of irrational action, you will be driven towards your original starting point of universal poverty. Okay, so I think we can now begin to appreciate why wealth is important, but how is wealth created? So look, if you want something you value, you can either make it yourself, let's call it self-sufficiency, or you can get it from someone else. But if you want to get it from someone else, there are only three ways of doing so. The first is, let's call it plunder, meaning you steal it from someone else without their permission, like through force or fraud, right? Um, this doesn't create wealth, it simply transfers wealth from the victim to the thief. Now, note that not only does it not create wealth, it discourages the victim from being productive in the future, because why produce wealth if I'm not going to be able to keep it? And on the other hand, even the thief is discouraged from future productive activity, because why be productive if it is easier to simply steal something, right? Of course, for ethical reasons, I hope they wouldn't, but let's just stick with the economics here. Okay, the other way is to rely on pleading, meaning I'm not going to take it without your permission, but I'm going to request to you to give me something that I want, right? In the way of alms, charity, gift, or inheritance, and so forth. Now, this doesn't create wealth either, right? It's also only a transfer of wealth from one person to another. The third way is production and trade, meaning I produce one thing, you produce another thing, and then we trade these two things if I want what you have and you want what I have. Now this creates wealth, and we'll talk more about this later. But given that there are two ways to create wealth, if it is our aim to move from poverty to prosperity, is it better to be self-sufficient or is it better to engage in trade with other people? Let's turn to that question next. Okay. Um, let's take two cases in order to understand the benefits of specialization and trade over self-sufficiency. So in this case, we're going to take extremely simple examples, but the principles translate to the entire global economy. So in this case, we have two people, they need to make two things. Life is simple, right? But the same principle scales up to billions of people and billions of things, right? So Alice and Bob can make some number of cups per day or some number of plates per day, but not both. And here we can see that Alice is clearly better at making cups and Bob is better at making plates. Now suppose they work by themselves, right? And they work for 2 days, 1 day for each item. So at the end of it, Alice has 10 cups and 5 plates and Bob has 5 cups and 10 plates. Let's use this as a reference and compare it with what they could achieve through the use of specialization and trade. Now in the same amount of time, if Alice and Bob both stuck with what they're better at with their specialization, right? Then Alice could produce 20 cups and Bob could produce 20 plates. After trade, they would both have 10 cups and 10 plates, which is more than either had working alone, right? So in this way, specialization and trade is win-win. Both parties are better off engaging in trade than they were working alone, even if they work the same amount, right? This is what we mean when we say that specialization in trade creates wealth that wouldn't otherwise exist. Now, hopefully this is a very simple example, but let's also look at a slightly more complicated example. So suppose Alice is an extremely motivated person and she decided to get better at producing both cups and plates. Now at this point, obviously Bob still wants to trade with Alice because Alice is so much more productive. But does Alice have any incentive to continue trading with Bob? That's the question, right? Now again, if they're working alone, um, 2 days, one day per item, Alice has 20 cups and 20 plates, that's a total of 40 items. And Bob has 5 cups and 10 plates, that's a total of 15 items. Now suppose they engage in specialization and trade again. Observe that Alice is 4 times better at making cups, but only twice as good as Bob at making plates. So what this means is, if Alice stuck with her comparative advantage, which is making cups, and Bob stuck with his relative comparative advantage, excuse me, that is at making plates, then at the end of 2 days, they would together have produced 40 cups and 20 plates. Now, many trade agreements would be possible between the two that would be win-win. For instance, Alice could keep 30 cups and 13 plates, leaving her with a total of 43 items, and Bob could have 10 cups and 7 plates, leaving him with a total of 17 items. Both of these numbers are more than what they would have had working alone. So again, conclusion, even when one person is better at all the tasks, specialization in trade is still win-win, and it creates wealth that wouldn't otherwise exist. Now I should mention in the passing a third case. Even if Alice was exactly the same times better, so let's say Alice was 4 times better at making cups and 4 times better at making plates. In this case, there is no comparative advantage, and as such, there is no need to trade in the present. But by continuing on this path, they will both be able to eventually develop a comparative advantage in specialization in one thing or the other. So there is always benefit in specialization and trade. And this is just two people, two things. Imagine this being scaled to billions of people and billions of things. So there's always some competitive advantage that you have that you can find out or develop. All right, so this brings us to the summary of this section. Specialization in trade is what I'd like to call like the atomic unit or like the micro unit, the fundamental building block that takes us from a state of universal poverty to a state of universal prosperity for everyone involved in the specialization and trade. Now let's spend a few minutes looking at how you can directly benefit your life today with this knowledge about specialization and trade, or the lessons of comparative advantage. So this helps you delegate effectively, right? You do not have to do everything yourself. In fact, as the economist Jacob Clifford puts it, self-sufficiency leads to inefficiency and inefficiency leads to poverty. So focus on your comparative advantage and delegate the rest. You can always be helpful. This is an extremely positive mindset, and it is absolutely logical and backed by economic reasoning. Even when one person is better at you than everything, you can benefit from them and they can benefit from you. So focus on finding and developing your own comparative advantage. Celebrate other people's growth. So instead of being envious of the growth of other people, be inspired by it and recognize that someone else getting better is good for you too. I mean, it's obviously good for them when they get better at doing their things, but you also benefit from it. So the most experienced person can still benefit from the least experienced person. Now, at home, there's always a bunch of errands or chores to be done, and maybe in some households there's one person doing all the chores. I'm not sure if it works out that well over the long run. And then also in many relatively modern households, in an attempt to improve on the previous arrangement, uh, many people come up with the concept of like a 50-50 workload division, right? Like I do half of everything and you do half of everything. But that's not productive either because you're not utilizing your comparative advantages. So instead of you doing both cooking and cleaning, and then your your partner also doing both cooking and cleaning, if you're better at cooking, you do the cooking. And if you're better at cleaning, you take care of the cleaning. And that way you will both save time that can then be used for your other leisurely goals and other activities. Avoid zero-sum thinking. So a zero-sum game is where for one person to win, another person has to lose. And because of the games that we typically expose ourselves to, like soccer, football, cricket, and so forth, basketball, right, where you see in a narrow sense that there is a winner and there is a loser, people can end up developing this false mindset that in life, for you to win, you have to bring down someone else, or if someone else won, it means you are a loser, right? But if you engage in this holistic approach of specialization and trade, it's win-win, and that's the kind of game you want to play in life. In fact, several extremely toxic fallacies in certain schools of economics and in the Marxist line, it comes from this line of zero-sum thinking, where if if my analysis only looks at the fact that one person is benefiting and it doesn't look at the other side, then I can falsely infer from them that since A won, then B must have lost. So avoid this kind of thinking in your mindset. Now, lastly, this is also a good civic responsibility, and we'll talk more about this later. But the economic policy enacted in any country follows from the majority opinion on what a good economic policy would be. And so it becomes the responsibility of every single person that benefits from specialization and trade to be aware about this basic economic reasoning and be able to explain it to others so that we may benefit from the universalization of specialization and trade instead of having a universal harm due to plunder. Okay, now, so far we were only talking about a very simplistic situation where there are just two people and two goods, but obviously life is way more complicated than that, right? And so that gives us a bunch of obvious limitations of this direct exchange approach, and then we need a way to solve it, to address these problems. Now, the first is a double coincidence of wants, meaning if a shoemaker wants bread, then he needs to find a baker that's also looking for shoes at the same time. Or through a long chain of reasoning, finally be able to make this trade, right? And then there's no standard unit of account. So the price of each good needs to be calculated in terms of every other good. So a shoe is worth so and so many bread. A shoe is worth so and so many pencils, or so and so many plates, and so forth for millions and billions of things, right? And so it's just not practical to arrange an economy that way. Also, there's the problem of indivisibility of certain goods. So a car manufacturer who wants to go buy bread can't sell half a car for bread, right? Or imagine that you have a cow and you want to buy some stationery. You can't sell half a cow, then the cow loses its value, right? Okay. The other problem is uh, limited specialization potential. So by that what I mean is specialization is only possible in a large enough market with enough demand for each good and service. So I cannot afford to spend several years becoming an engineer or becoming a doctor and then even having a specialization within that field trying to find a cure for a rare disease if there aren't other people who need who have such a specific requirement. And since the number of trades is severely limited in a barter economy, it would actually also severely limit the specialization potential. So due to all of these problems and maybe more, um, barter is simply not a feasible mode of establishing an economy. So how can we solve these problems? And hopefully this is not completely a surprise to you because I hope you use something called money. Yeah. Okay, so to address the limitations of barter economy, we need something which can perform certain functions and it has certain properties. Now, something that performs these functions may be called money. So it must be a medium of exchange, meaning um, everyone must be willing to exchange what they have for money and then buy what they have with money, right? It has to be a unit of account in the sense that the price of everything is in terms of this currency, this money, this rupees or dollars and so forth. Now I want to put an asterisk there. There's a difference between money and currency as well, but we'll come to that in a bit. And then it must be a store of value. Um, so this thing must retain its value over a long period of time, right? So to make savings and investment and all of these deferred payments possible, meaning I buy something today, but let's say I want to pay for it tomorrow, so I'm taking up a loan maybe and so forth. So if if bread is used as money, bread is going to decay within a week, or even if you use some grains, they're going to rot within, let's say, 6 months, right? And so this is not long enough this is not long term enough for it to work well as money. You can't lose the value of your money over time, because then you've lost the value of the effort that you put into your initial production. So what properties would a physical commodity need to have in order to perform these functions well? So these are the 5 properties that, of a good money, right? So it must be durable, it must last a long time without decaying or breaking down. So like not bread. It must be fungible. So each unit of money should be interchangeable with any other unit of money. So like maybe not shells, because each shell is a little bit different from the other shell, right? It must be portable. So it must be small enough, or like light enough for you to easily carry. So obviously something like cows would not work for that purpose. Or yeah, it must be divisible. So again, cows is a good example here, or you could think of cars or motorbikes and so forth, right? So it must be possible to subdivide it to make change, right? Um, that's how you can basically buy smaller quantities of things in the market or greater quantities of things in the market. And then finally, scarcity. So the supply of money should be very difficult to manipulate, or it will lose its trade value. So imagine if someone proposed using sand as money, right? Um, it might be easier to get mud or sand than it is to work or to produce something and trade it to get sand. So why bother at all, right? So there is an inherent element of scarcity which is also involved in good money. So which naturally occurring substances found almost in all cultures and in several geographies satisfy these requirements? Well, the answer is up on the screen. Gold and silver, these are precious metals, and they can be standardized in the form of bars and coins, and they would have all of these properties. So that is why so many societies have considered gold and silver to be actual good money. So now here's a point of discussion that we probably won't go into in a lot of detail today, but um, the money that we use today is called fiat money, meaning the government prints this money and it's not backed by a physical commodity such as gold or silver. So does this satisfy all of the properties of good money? And if not, then we should try to change our language to not use the same word for it. We should call it currency. So this is something I'll let you think about this. So by the way, in my opinion, yes, currency is not money. It is a receipt that on a gold standard, meaning when money was printed in in proportion to the amount of gold that your government held in reserve. At that point of time, you could say that it was a claim onto money. It was a receipt on money. And over here we can see like it is a 500 rupee note. And over here we can read, I promise to pay the bearer the sum of 500 rupees. Meaning this note is not 500 rupees. It's a promissory note that you can deposit to get 500 rupees. That should have been in the form of gold, but we are no longer on a gold standard in any major country, which has implications that we can't get into today. Okay, let's talk about the question of value. So for a long time, like going back to ancient Greece, people have tried to solve this paradox of why do people value diamonds more than water? I mean, think about it, right? Like water is essential to human life, and diamonds are basically just glittery stones that look pretty. But people are willing to pay so much more for a diamond than they are for water, right? So what is the answer to that? Okay. Um, value, the nature of value is that it is subjective, meaning the value of a product or a service is not the result of the effort or the labor that went into producing it. That is simply a component of its cost, not of its value, right? So the value of a product comes from the benefit or the utility derived by the one who is consuming the product or service, right? So for instance, making mud pies might require effort, but that does not make it valuable to others. So let's point out this very clearly, that value is neither in the product itself. So over here we have two t-shirts that are exactly alike in their material and so forth, right? But on the one on the left is a photo of Karl Marx, and on the one on the right is a photo, that image that basically says Ayn Rand was right. And I would not buy the one on the left for, I wouldn't take it for free, and I would pay money for the one on the right, right? And now if you're a Marxist listening to this, then maybe you do the opposite, right? Okay, so value is neither in the product or in the object itself, like in the t-shirt, nor is it in the consumer's desires by itself, like in my mind. So value is not like I just dream up an invisible unicorn, right? You don't just make it up, but it's in a relationship between the two. So when a product objectively satisfies the subject's desires, it is valuable to the subject. Okay, so another important characteristic about value is that value is marginal. But what this means is, in living our life, we are not faced with the alternative of choosing a whole category of one thing or a whole category of another thing. Like, you don't have to choose between all the apples in the world and all the milk in the world. So every additional unit of a certain type of object is what you value. And so let's say if you like Indian cuisine, right? Maybe if you're a diehard fan of pav bhaji, right? Um, you might like it a lot, but at the end of 10 days of having it straight, you might want something else, because the 10th day is not as much fun as the first day. So that's the diminishing marginal value of the next additional unit of that particular good, right? So if I have only 1 gallon of water, I might really want that 1 gallon of water, right? I might use it for drinking. I might use the second gallon of water for, let's say, cleaning, right? I might use the third gallon for taking a shower. And if I have a fourth gallon, I might water my plants and so forth, right? The priorities might be different. I'm just giving you an example. Um, so this is the answer to the diamond water paradox. The reason diamonds cost a lot and water costs very little in a developed society is because, thankfully, there is an abundance of water for at least people who are above the extreme poverty line, right? And in a developed society and so forth. And the big theme here is, how can we reach that state for everyone? So every additional unit of diamond is far more valuable, simply because people typically don't have that much of it, and the supply of diamond is far lower than the supply of water available to them for their consumption. Okay, so far we've looked at the necessity for of economic knowledge if you want to achieve human flourishing, how specialization in trade is the basic atomic block, the building block that takes a society from the state of universal poverty to prosperity, the use of money in enabling both specialization and trade, and the concept of value, like what gives a particular good or service value is the, the, the utility that the consumer derives from it. Now, with all of this in mind, I want to turn our attention towards something called the calculation problem, which deals with how prices help determine what to produce, how much of it to produce, and how to produce it. And there may be multiple ways of producing something. So how do we decide which way to produce it? Okay, so about a month ago, maybe, I was taking a flight, and during this flight, I was just I was just introspecting on how lucky I am that I live at a time where I can take a flight from one end of the US to another for just a few $100, right? And I'm sure we would all like for it to be cheaper, but just think about it. And then I started thinking about how much could I really do by myself without relying on specialization and trade with other people, right? So let's say that the flight cost me like $400 or something, right? So could I do that by myself? Like absolutely not. So I mean, obviously I couldn't make an aircraft myself, right? But then I started thinking, well, what could I make myself? So I can't make an aircraft myself. Can I make a car by myself? No, I can't make a car by myself. Can I make a motorbike by myself? No. Can I make a bicycle by myself? And when I say by myself, I mean like starting from natural resources only, no DIY kits, no other human made products, and no prior human knowledge, right? That just by myself, right? So I couldn't even make a simple bicycle by myself. And then I started thinking, well, could I make could I make a wheel by myself? And honestly, probably not, because I couldn't even make a circle by myself. Because even to make a circle, I would need the compass that will help me make a perfect circle, right? Or even on paper. So I need paper, I need a pencil, and I need a compass just to make a circle. And then you wonder about, is this it? Like, could I make a pencil by myself? And there's a very famous essay called I Pencil by Leonard Reed, who's the founder of Foundation for Economic Education. And Leonard Reed beautifully explains in this essay how no single person even knows how to make something as simple as a pencil by themselves. Now, at first, this just seems like an extremely silly thought, right? Like, how difficult is it? It's just a piece of wood, some graphite in it, right? And maybe an eraser at the back. So yeah, to make a pencil, you need wood, you need graphite, you need rubber, you need brass. Let's just stick with that. But how do you get the wood? You need to cut down some trees, for which you need to make a saw. How do you make a saw? You need to make some steel. But how do you make some steel? You need a steel mill, for which you need like iron ore and electricity and so forth. And then this entire chain also applies for graphite and rubber and brass, right? So the point is that it's extremely difficult to even make something as simple as a pencil yourself without collaboration with other human beings. But that's just part of the mystery, right? The miracle is that not only do pencils get made every single day, but somehow we also know how many pencils do we need to make. Because obviously you don't want to divert all the wood in the world towards making pencils, right? Because you're going to waste the pencils and we're all going to suffer because there is no wood. So that's obviously an exaggeration, but the miracle is, how does it still function that we managed to make pencils that no one knows how to make, and we managed to figure out the quantity of these pencils required, right? And this collaboration is happening between people all over the globe, for all the entire supply chains, and people who speak different languages, they may have different religions, they may not like each other, and they're still cooperating without any kind of a king or a central authority or government putting necessarily like putting a gun to their head and saying, hey, you have to cooperate in order to get this done, right? Completely voluntarily. Now, I'll put an asterisk that in the real world, if it doesn't happen voluntarily, that's not a necessary feature of this system. It's an aberration in the system. Okay, Yeah, so like I said, we also know how many pencils of each type we need on any given day. And now remember, you need this information not just for pencils, but for everything from pencils and erasers to aircrafts and houses and every single type of medicine and so forth, right? So without this information, we would have too much of some things, which is a waste or a surplus, and too little of other things. Now, too much of one thing also means too little of something else because the resources used for one thing cannot be used for some other thing. Yeah, and so in the absence of this information, or when this information is distorted, or to the degree that it is distorted, um, we faced widespread famines and deaths in the past. So how can we solve this serious problem? So to answer that question, we need to understand what is the price system and how does it work. Okay, so the price of any commodity, again, as simple as a pencil or an eraser to something as fancy as an aircraft or a mansion, it contains within it both information and a certain incentive for the producers and consumers involved in the system, in the producers who will make that thing and consumers who want that thing, who are willing to buy that thing. And all of this is assuming no like purely just self-interested producers and consumers, right? Like they're not being forced by any central authority to participate in this system. So let's take a concrete example. So suppose you have an exam season coming up, and this puts a higher pressure on demand for pencils, right? Now, as a result of this, you will see a higher price for pencils because there are a lot of people willing to bid to buy pencils. And so the shopkeepers can make a lot of money selling pencils, right? Now, this higher price for pencils sends a signal to producers and to consumers. So let's look at the producer front, right? It is implicitly telling producers that look, a certain resource, pencils, is in short supply. We need more of it. It needs more production. Now that's information, right? And now the incentive is if you make and sell more pencils, you'll make more money, higher profit. So there's a unity between the needs of the society and the incentive of the producers to benefit through the satisfaction of the needs of society. Now, similarly, there's an implicit signal sent to consumers. Hey, look, this resource is in short supply and it needs conservation. It's on short supply. So if you don't really need it now, if you use less of it now, you'll save more money, and then maybe you can buy it once it's not as expensive again in the future. So again, this is providing a unity between benefit to the society through the way in which a certain resource is utilized and benefit to the consumers in the way that they save more money if they do this thing. So there's a unity, there's a harmony of interests here, a win-win. So both the producer and the consumer are motivated only by their self-interest, higher profit, higher savings, and yet what they do is also socially beneficial. So in this way, a profit and loss based system tracks helps supply track changes in demand. So if the demand increases, there's a higher profit to be made because of higher prices, and then the supply can rise to match up with it. If the demand falls again, now there's not as much profit to be made, or maybe you'll be in a loss if you keep producing then, and so then the supply falls again. And in this way, you have this control system, effectively like distributed control system, if you understand the terminology, for supply to track changes in demand. There's a beautiful quote from Adam Smith, who's often regarded as the father of modern economics, although he didn't get everything right. But the beautiful quote is, "It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest." And Adam Smith called this the invisible hand. So like I'm just trying to benefit my life, but in the process I help you as well, and everyone does that by engaging in this system where there's a harmony of interests. So the calculation problem, meaning what to produce, how much to produce, and so forth, requires on this tremendous amount of information that not only doesn't that cannot be computed by any centrally planned authority or a government, right? And remember, this is information also about just simply the desires that everyone has in that country, in that community, and so forth. So it's not necessarily just the objective facts about the world, but also the subjective desires that people have, based on their standard of value. So the economist Ludwig von Mises came up with this critique of centrally planned economies, and this critique can be summarized as follows. Without private property, there can be no specialization in trade. Because in order to trade, I need to own what I'm selling you, and you need to own what you are selling me, right? So that's private property. Without trade, there can be no prices, because prices as we understood it, they emerge as a result of these millions and billions of trade decisions that influence the supply and demand and help the supply track demand, right? Now, someone could just slap a number onto an item saying, hey, this pencil costs $1 million, but then who's going to buy it, right? It's a distorted signal, and it would actually send a false information to the manufacturers and the consumers and so forth about the actual scarcity of that resource versus the false signal that is given here. Anyway, so without trade, there can be no prices. Without prices, supply cannot track changes in demand because there is no profit and loss system to encourage producers to scale up or scale down the production of a certain commodity, or maybe divert their resources into producing some other commodity that might be more profitable at the time. Now, when this happens, when supply cannot track changes in demand, then production decisions are made in the dark, which means there are mass shortages or mass surpluses, wastage of goods and services. So this leads to mass shortages, which manifests in the way of mass starvation and deaths. So this is an extremely important critique of any centrally planned economy. I recommend you to go through all of the sources that I've linked over here, especially let's say the first three. The fourth one is if you're interested in figuring out how this also relates to, let's say, prices in the stock market. Yeah, I recommend going through all of these resources to really wrap your head around this. It's a fundamental critique of any centrally planned economy, which is like, let's say, socialism, right? In contrast to capitalism, which would be like a system of private property and a free market price-based system based on like profit and loss. Okay, so one obvious question at this point is, why be extreme? Like, why choose between pure capitalism or like a pure free market system versus like pure socialism or like a completely centrally planned economy? Why not be like somewhere in the middle, right? Like a mixed economy. And in fact, almost all countries today, they are mixed economies. India is a mixed economy. US is a mixed economy. The Scandinavian countries are a mixed economy, and so forth. Now, that doesn't mean that they're equally, that the mix of capitalistic and socialistic elements in them are equal or the same, but there's some mix of the market economy and the government control of the economy. So why not just stay somewhere in the middle, or maybe we should stay somewhere in the middle, right? So I want to point out this extremely interesting and important essay called "The Middle of the Road Leads to Socialism" by Ludwig von Mises. I'm at attaching the link here. It's not a very long essay. I recommend you read it, but I'll try to summarize some of the argument for you. So we'll look at only one government intervention because that's all the time we have today. So suppose that in an otherwise entirely free market system, now let's keep aside how problematic you think such a system would be, but suppose you have such a system, and then the only government intervention in it, apart from like the protection of people against plunder, the protection of people's private property, and allowing them to engage in this profit and loss free market based system, the only intervention is a price ceiling, right? So let's say the government considers the price of some product, some essential product maybe, as too high. So let's say milk is selling for $5 a gallon, and this is too high. And due to this, according to the government, people can't buy enough milk. Maybe they got this feedback from the people. So in order to try to solve this problem, suppose the government says, look, we are passing a law. No one's allowed to sell milk for more than $3 a gallon. It's an essential commodity, and we want people to have access to milk. So you can't make it more expensive than $3 a gallon. Now that's the intention and the means to try to satisfy that intention. But remember, we want to judge policies based on their actual effects instead of simply looking at the intention. So what happens when the government passes such a law? Any producer whose cost of production exceeds this $3 a gallon, which is the price ceiling, will now incur a loss. Now this producer cannot continue producing at a loss. Eventually it will run out of business. And realistically, before that, the producer will switch to producing something else instead of milk that is now relatively more profitable because of this new law. So for instance, maybe the law applies to milk, but not to making butter or cheese. So then instead of selling milk, why not just make butter or cheese out of it and sell that, since there's no price cap on butter or cheese. So recognize how this was a self-sabotaging intervention. Like it's obvious that this policy harms milk producers, but clearly that wasn't the intention. Like helping them wasn't the intention. However, contrary to the intention being to make more milk available to consumers, this actually causes a shortage of milk, and so less milk is available to consumers because of this policy. So even on its own terms, this policy is something that backfires, right? It creates these shortages. But that's not all. There's something even more pernicious about such a policy, which let me summarize by calling it universal control. So let's see what that means, right? So now that the government notices that there is a shortage of milk in the market, it has two options, right? Either repeal the price controls, saying, well, okay, we made a mistake, this is not giving us the result that we wanted, or it can address the concerns that caused certain producers to stop producing milk. So here's the thing, right? The reason the government introduced the price control to begin with is because such a measure is popularly supported. Otherwise, it would be reversed in like as soon as possible anyway, right? When people don't vote for an unpopular measure. So now the government is stuck with a position where people think price controls are a good thing, and they don't recognize or they don't observe the relation between price control and its actual effect. Maybe they're judging it, maybe they're judging the policy by its name or its intent, right? So now what the government will do is it will ask the affected businesses, hey, why did you stop producing? And suppose the businesses say, like, they fairly, right? You controlled our output price, the price at which I can sell milk, but you did nothing to lower my input price, the price of everything that I need to produce milk, right? Be it like cows or like grains for cows and the energy that I need in my milk producing factory and a bunch of other things, right? all of those things are still costing me the same amount, but somehow I'm supposed to sell it for a lower price. So I was already doing the best I could because I was already looking to maximize profit, but now this is simply not profitable for me. And so what the government did for milk, it would then have to do to all the inputs that go into producing milk. But because of this, the shortage that we saw for milk will then also happen for each of those items. In turn, it will have to then go to the inputs of those items and repeat this process. Now, in a completely interconnected economy, as we saw in that pencil example, this price ceiling would eventually ripple out to all sectors of the economy. Now, on top of that, if any sector was somehow exempt from price controls, what you would obviously see is people will divert their resources, their labor, their capital into that sector because there's a greater scope to make profit in that domain compared to the domain which has a price cap on it, right? But that means there is lower investment precisely where the government wants greater supply in goods that government considers essential, which is obviously unacceptable. So here we started with a political system that supports the right to private property, meaning I'm not going to control or cap or restrict you on you own a certain thing. As long as a buyer and a seller agree, you can sell it at that price, right? So there's right to this private property, right? But now every new control chips away at this right. Like there's price controls on milk, and then there's price control on the inputs to milk, and then the inputs to that, and then all the economy is interconnected, and energy is the industry that powers every other industry. And eventually there'll be controls on energy itself, which will cause shortages to ripple out all throughout the economy, right? So every new control is breeding more controls until eventually the system is transformed into a completely like a command economy, a centrally planned economy, right? So in this case, there is a true slippery slope that exists if plunder or a violation of private property is accepted in any form, right? And this is again just to take one simple example. A more complete presentation should go through dozens of examples of this happening to sort of give more data to generalize this principle of the middle of the road leading to socialism. But here for now we just use one example. And note again that we already discussed how a centrally planned economy or command economy or socialism or communism or call it what you may, it fails to solve the calculation problem, leading to mass shortages, starvation, and deaths. Okay, now I think we are ready to sort of try to summarize or create some general guidelines for us on what is the proper role of law given what we now understand about basic economics. So this leads us to an extremely important principle that Frederic Bastiat talks about in his book called The Law. Um, so recall we talked about the three ways of getting something from someone else, right? The first way was plunder. So we're going to develop on this idea a little bit over here. So Bastiat asks the question like, what is plunder? How do I identify plunder? And he gives a simple criteria to do so. When a portion of wealth is transferred from the person who owns it to someone who does not own it without the owner's consent through the use of force or fraud, meaning either I threaten you at gunpoint or I simply take it without your knowledge and your permission, right? This is an act of plunder. The right to property has been violated, plunder has been committed. Now this I recommend you to like just pause and read this quote on the screen right now. So for each of these, ask yourself whether they meet Bastiat's definition of plunder, right? I'm going to set a bunch of examples in front of you. Theft, taking from one, giving to the other. Robbery, same thing, maybe at gunpoint. Burglary, breaking into someone's house, stealing something, taking from one, giving to the other. Slavery. So slavery is essentially the maybe even like the worst of them all, right? Where you're not only like robbing someone today, but you have sort of kidnapped and enslaved them for their life or for a long time, and you are constantly um, robbing them of the product of their labor as well as of their own liberty over their life, right? So those are all examples of plunder that are commonly illegal. But recognize that nothing about the definition of a plunder has to do with the current legality of that thing, right? So there can also be things that are legal but that are still plunder by this definition. So here are a few examples of that, right? Price controls, the one that we just talked about, would be an example of plunder. Wage controls, such as a minimum wage law, or wage is the price of labor, right? Wage is the price of borrowing someone's labor. So I pay you a certain wage in exchange for your labor and so forth. And then rent controls or interest controls, and maybe some of these terms aren't familiar to you, but we'll have to get into that in one of our subsequent videos. So for today, if you're familiar with the terms, just think about whether they fit the definition of plunder. Similarly, you have tariffs and export subsidies. A tariff is a tax on imported goods into a country. Um, think about whether this meets the definition of plunder. Export subsidies, any kind of government subsidies or loans or bailouts, like the government freebies, could be to corporations or could be to the common man in form of freebies like food and education and healthcare and so forth. Important things, definitely. We want these things. The question here is only whether what is the best way to get those things, and whether this matches the definition of plunder. Because to fund all of these things, you need to first take money or resources from someone in order to provide it to someone else, or in order to pay the person who is going to provide this service to someone else, right? Similarly, anti-automation regulations. Now, this is another kind of barrier where, um, I am willing to use my property in a certain way. I want to invest in some automation. I want to improve my processes, but maybe there are laws against doing so. And to the degree that this is not a matter of me harming someone else's life or property, this would be an example of legal plunder, right? And of course, like starting a war, that's plunder at a massive scale. And the corresponding taxation that is used for to support any of these above forms of plunder. Now, I understand at this point the criticisms that might come my way, because taxation is such a huge topic. But at the very least, for right now, we can say that even if there is taxation, it should not be used to support legal plunder, because to that degree, the taxation is also an act of legal plunder. Although I believe the full case goes for any form of taxation which which matches this definition. Okay, so what are the destructive effects of plunder, right? Yeah. So two huge things. Right? Let's just drill this in a generalized way. Plunder is self-destructive. In the long run, plunder harms both the victim and the thief. So if I take a dollar from Alice and give it to Bob, then Alice no longer has the incentive to produce that dollar, because why produce things that you don't get to keep, right? Why I could have done something else with my time and energy and so forth. And likewise, Bob has no incentive to produce it, because why produce it if I'm getting it for free, or because of plunder, right? So in this effect, plunder over time discourages production and in fact encourages more plunder, effectively killing the goose that lays the golden egg, as the saying goes. And the second big problem is plunder is self-replicating. So we saw in this example of how one price control leads to all the price controls universally across all sectors of the economy, right? And so when this happens, like when plunder is tolerated or even encouraged, it breeds more plunder, eventually resulting in a centrally planned economy or a command economy or socialism, whatever you want to call it, a dictatorship. And such a state cannot solve the calculation problem, leading to mass shortages, starvation, and deaths. So with that being said, what is the proper role of law according to Bastiat, right? Now, it's an open question about what you think about this. I'd like to hear about it in the comments, so you can reach out to me. Um, so the proper purpose or the proper role of law is to protect people and their property against plunder by others, including members of the government itself. Meaning the government doesn't get to plunder either. Nobody gets to initiate plunder, right? The only responsibility of government is neither will I plunder you nor will I let others plunder you. So the government can fail, the law can fail to do this in two fundamental ways, which is to to engage in plunder itself, right? Like legal plunder, which is to forcibly take from one and give to the other, or forcibly stand in the way of two people coming to a voluntary agreement, right? If I want to work for a certain wage and you're willing to provide me a job at that wage, but the government says no, no, you have to have at least a higher wage in order to take this job, right? So that means that by mutual consent, we could have agreed to this agreement, but it didn't work out because of plunder, right? Or the other big way is the government fails to punish people who engage in plunder, right? So if the government lets robberies and thefts and there was a time when slavery was legal, if it lets these things go unchecked, then it breeds more plunder and discourages production, and thereby driving us back into the state of our initial universal poverty, away from a state of universal prosperity and flourishing and so forth. Okay, so now even if you've understood everything I've said so far, um, and that it's totally fair if you don't agree with the things that I've said so far, I would like to engage in a further conversation on that. But there might still be another question in your mind, like, hey Yash, why did I have to know all of this? Like, why can't a specialist take care of this? I mean, we just talked about specialization in trade. This is not my specialization, so what the hell? Like, why did you put me through this? Or why, to be fair, you put yourself through it. Okay, so here's the thing, right? Since specialization and trade is what we all benefit from, the protection and value of specialization in trade is itself properly understood as general knowledge. That itself cannot be a specialization, right? So I'm going to put three quotes on the screen that will hopefully shed some light on this topic, although a lot more can be said about it. The fact that so many successful politicians are such shameless liars is not only a reflection on them, it is also a reflection on us. When the people want the impossible, only liars can satisfy. So this is an economist, Thomas Sowell, right? Now Thomas Sowell understands specialization in trade, and even if he were the economic advisor of America, right, he couldn't change things, because if people don't want the right things, or if they think that harmful things are if the things that are actually harmful they assume to be helpful, then they're gonna get what's coming their way, or at least what the majority is asking for, right? And so another economist, Milton Friedman, says, right, um, I do not believe that the solution to our problem is simply to elect the right people, right? The important thing is to establish a political climate of opinion which will make it politically profitable for the wrong people to do the right thing. For the wrong people to do the right thing. Because think about this, unless it's politically profitable for the wrong people to do the right thing, the right people will not be able to do it either, or if they do, if they try, they will shortly be out of office. I wasn't exactly quoting Friedman, but you can pause and read the quote. Yeah. So Ronald Reagan, one of the prior presidents of the United States, said it beautifully, in my opinion, that freedom is a fragile thing and it is never more than one generation away from extinction. It is not ours by way of inheritance. It must be fought for and defended constantly by each generation. For it comes only once to a people. And those in world history who have known freedom and then lost it have never known it again. So to summarize, politics or the laws of a land follow from what the majority of the voices or voters in that society are willing to vote for. Now, even if you're not a voter, you still have a voice that can influence voters, and so you still indirectly have that civic responsibility to the degree that you want human flourishing for yourself, for your family, for your community, and so forth. So what can you do to that end? The silent majority achieves nothing. It's ignored. So learn to use your voice effectively and respectfully, right? So understand these ideas better. Like, never communicate things you do not understand or you're not convinced by. So step one is spend more time, understand these ideas better, go through the further learning materials. When you feel like you at least you're somewhat there, you agree with the big picture, there are questions that still need to be resolved. All right, that's a constant learning process. Share this presentation with others and maybe discuss this material in a group setting, right? So by answering questions from others, you might clarify your own understanding, or when someone asks you a question, you might realize that you thought something was clear to you, but it isn't, right? All of that is beautiful. That's scope for further discussion. And then finally, please subscribe to my channel for more content. It really makes a difference that if you like my content, leave a like, comment, and share it with your friends and family. It's more than appreciation. It helps make this video reach a larger audience. And so if you think that these ideas are valuable, and if you share the same goal with me for human flourishing, then help me spread these ideas to a larger audience. Thank you. Okay, before I go, here's a quick summary of everything we learned today. So if there's everything else that's jumbled in your mind, we can just quickly summarize this. Freedom today leads to prosperity tomorrow, and prosperity today leads to flourishing tomorrow. Here are two very interesting charts that show us this. So in this chart, you see freedom on the x-axis and prosperity on the y-axis. And the more free a country is, the higher its prosperity, right? And over here, by freedom, I mean legal protection for each person's right to their life, liberty, and private property against the initiation of violent force or fraud by others, plunder. And prosperity is the state of an abundance of life-enriching goods and services. So you can see that the countries that are less free are also less prosperous. Next, prosperity leads to flourishing. So on the x-axis here, we have the GDP per capita, which is essentially like a measure of uh, the average wealth of a person in a country. And this is real GDP per capita because it's all normalized to a particular year, 2021. You don't have to understand what I just said in tremendous detail. Just understand that it's a measure of wealth, average wealth per person on the x-axis, and on the y-axis you have something called the Human Development Index, which is essentially an aggregate measure of the length, having a long and healthy life, literacy, and a good standard of living. So the higher the wealth of an average person, the higher the human development index of that country. Now, this does bring us to another set of questions about, hey, if this is the average wealth, then what about the deviation from the average, right? Like, what about the rich people and the poor people and so forth? All that is fair. It's a discussion for another day. But for now, regardless of all of that, we do see that on average, higher wealth per capita leads to higher human flourishing. These are some of the further learning resources that I would recommend. For most of these, there's a video summary or interviews by the author. Take a look at that. I highly recommend these resources, and thank you so much for your time.